December 20th, 1943. The skies over northern Germany were a frozen battlefield. At 25,000 feet, the air was thin, the cold was brutal, and death could come from any direction. That morning, a formation of American B-17 flying fortresses from a 379th Bomb Group took off from RAF Kimballton in England. Their target, the Focke-Wulf aircraft manufacturing plant in Bremen, a critical cog in the Nazi war machine. Among the bombers was a relatively inexperienced crew flying a B-17F nicknamed E Old Pub. It was only their first or second mission. At the controls was Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, a 21-year-old farm boy from West Virginia. His crew of 9 included gunners, a navigator, a bombardier, and an engineer, all young, all brave, and all about to face the unimaginable. As they neared Bremen, the flak began. German anti-aircraft guns opened up with deadly precision. Black puffs of smoke filled the sky, and shrapnel tore through the air. Ye Old Pub was hit almost immediately. One engine was knocked out, the nose was shredded, the oxygen system in the rear of the plane was destroyed, and the tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, was killed instantly. Then came the fighters. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s swarmed the formation like hornets. The bombers fought back with their 50 caliber machine guns, but Ye Old Pub, already damaged and lagging behind, became an easy target. One by one, the German fighters took turns attacking the crippled bomber. The fuselage was riddled with holes. The left stabilizer was nearly torn off. The top turret gunner was wounded. The radio operator was unconscious. The tail section was barely holding together. Charlie Brown was also wounded. A bullet had grazed his shoulder, but he refused to give up. With blood on his uniform and smoke in the cockpit, he gripped the controls and kept the plane in the air. Somehow, against all odds, they completed the bombing run and turned back towards England, alone, broken, and vulnerable. The crew tried to regroup. The intercom was out. The oxygen system was failing. They were flying low to stay conscious, but that made them easy prey. They were 250 miles from safety, deep in enemy territory, and losing altitude fast. Charlie Brown later recalled looking out the window and seeing the German countryside below, peaceful, snow-covered, unaware of the burning wreck limping overhead. He knew they wouldn't make it much farther. And then out of the haze came another shape, a fighter, a Messerschmitt Bf-109. The crew braced for the end. They had no way to fight back. The tail guns were destroyed, the top turret was jammed, the waist gunners were out of ammo, the bomber was defenseless, and the German pilot was closing in fast. But what happened next would defy every rule of war, every expectation, and every instinct of survival. While Charlie Brown and his battered B-17 struggled to stay airborne, another man was preparing for battle on the ground just outside Bremen. His name was Franz Stigler, a 28-year-old Luftwaffe fighter pilot with over 24 confirmed kills. He was a seasoned ace, respected by his peers and feared by his enemies. But what set him apart wasn't just his skill, it was his code of honor. Stigler had grown up in a devout Catholic family in Bavaria. Before the war, he had studied to become a priest, but when the conflict erupted, he joined the Luftwaffe, driven by duty and a desire to protect his homeland. He was trained by some of Germany's best pilots and quickly rose through the ranks. By 1943, he had flown hundreds of missions and earned the Iron Cross for bravery. That morning, Stigler was refueling and rearming his Messerschmitt Bf-109 when he heard the distant rumble of engines. Reports came in. A lone American bomber was limping away from Bremen, trailing smoke, flying low, and clearly damaged. It was an easy kill, a chance to add another victory to his record and earn the coveted Knight's Cross. He climbed into his cockpit, strapped in,
and took off. As he ascended into the cold December sky, he spotted the B-17 almost immediately. It was flying erratically, barely holding altitude. The tail was shredded, one engine was out, the rear guns were silent. It was a miracle the plane was still in the air. Stigler approached from behind, ready to fire, but as he closed the distance, something made him hesitate. Through the gaping holes in the fuselage, he could see the crew inside. One gunner was slumped over, clearly dead. Another was bandaging a wounded comrade. The pilot, Charlie Brown, was gripping the controls with blood on his face, trying desperately to keep the plane level. Stigler's finger hovered over the trigger, but he didn't pull it. He remembered something his commanding officer had once told him: "You fight with honor. If I ever hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." To Stigler, this bomber was no longer an enemy. It was a wounded bird struggling to survive. He pulled alongside the B-17, flying wingtip to wingtip. Inside the bomber, the American crew panicked. Was this it? Was he toying with them before the kill? But Stigler didn't fire. He didn't even raise his guns. Instead, he looked into the cockpit and locked eyes with Charlie Brown. Then, in a gesture that defied every rule of war, he saluted. Brown stared in disbelief. Stigler motioned for the bomber to turn north, toward neutral Sweden, but Brown refused. He was determined to make it back to England. Stigler understood. He nodded and did something even more unthinkable. He began escorting the bomber. For the next several minutes, the German ace flew alongside the crippled American bomber, guiding it out of German airspace. He knew that if any German anti-aircraft batteries spotted them, both planes could be shot down. But he didn't care. He was protecting them, not as enemies, but as fellow airmen. Eventually, as they neared the North Sea, Stigler gave one final salute, peeled away, and disappeared into the clouds. He never told anyone what he had done. To speak of it would have meant court-martial, or worse. Sparing the enemy was treason. But to Stigler, he didn't see it that way. He had followed his conscience. He had chosen mercy over murder. And he had let honor guide his hand. Back at base, he landed in silence. No victory claimed, no kill confirmed. Just a quiet return and a story he would carry alone for decades.
Franz Stigler's Messerschmitt Bf-109 glided silently alongside the battered B-17. The American bomber was barely holding together, its tail shredded, one engine dead, the fuselage riddled with holes. Inside, the crew was wounded, exhausted, and bracing for what they believed was their final moment. Stigler had every reason to fire. He was a decorated Luftwaffe ace with over 20 confirmed kills. One more would earn him the Knight's Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest military honors. The crippled bomber was an easy target. No escort fighters, no defensive fire, just a slow, wounded aircraft limping toward the North Sea. But as he looked closer, something shifted. Through the jagged holes in the fuselage, Stigler saw the faces of young men, not enemies, but human beings. One was slumped over, clearly dead. Another was tending to a wounded crewmate. The pilot, Charlie Brown, was gripping the controls with blood on his face, trying desperately to keep the plane level. Stigler's finger hovered over the trigger. He thought of his brother, who had been killed earlier in the war. He thought of the words his commanding officer had once told him: "If I ever hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself."
To Stigler, this bomber was no longer a target. It was a parachute in motion, a wounded bird, a symbol of courage. He pulled back. Instead of firing, he maneuvered his fighter to the bomber's wingtip. The American crew was stunned. Was this a trap? Was he toying with them before the kill? Charlie Brown later recalled the moment vividly. He looked out the cockpit window and saw the German pilot staring back, not with hatred, but with empathy. Then, slowly, Stigler raised his hand and saluted. Brown was speechless. In the chaos of war, such a gesture was unheard of. Stigler then motioned for the bomber to turn north toward neutral Sweden. But Brown refused. He was determined to make it back to England. Stigler understood. He nodded and then did something even more unthinkable. He began escorting the bomber. For the next several minutes, the German ace flew alongside the American bomber, guiding it out of German airspace. He knew that if any German anti-aircraft batteries spotted them, both planes could be shot down. But he didn't care. He was protecting them, not as enemies, but as fellow airmen. Inside the B-17, the crew watched in stunned silence. They had seen death. They had felt terror. But now they were witnessing something else: mercy. Eventually, as they neared the North Sea, Stigler gave one final salute, peeled away, and disappeared into the clouds. Charlie Brown and his crew made it back to England. Their bomber was barely intact, but they were alive. When they reported the incident, their superiors were skeptical. A German pilot sparing an American bomber? Escorting it to safety? It sounded impossible. But it wasn't. It was real. It was human. It was a moment that defied the brutality of war and reminded the world that even in the darkest skies, honor could still shine. Stigler returned to base in silence. He didn't claim the kill. He didn't tell his superiors. He knew that if word got out, he could be court-martialed, or worse. Sparing the enemy was treason. But he didn't see it that way. He had followed his conscience. He had chosen mercy over murder, and he had let honor guide his hand. For decades, the story remained buried, a secret carried by two men on opposite sides of a war. But it would not stay hidden forever.
The skies over northern Germany were now quiet, eerily quiet. The roar of flak guns had faded. The swarm of Luftwaffe fighters had vanished. And in that silence, two planes flew side by side. One a battered American B-17, the other a sleek German Messerschmitt Bf-109. Inside the B-17, Charlie Brown and his crew were stunned. Their bomber, Ye Old Pub, was barely holding together. The tail section was shredded. One engine was dead. The oxygen system was failing. They had no defensive firepower left. And yet the German fighter flying beside them hadn't fired a single shot. Charlie Brown looked out his cockpit window and saw the German pilot, Franz Stigler, staring back. Not with hatred, not with triumph, but with something else entirely. Empathy. Then, slowly, deliberately, Stigler raised his hand and saluted. Brown was speechless. In the chaos of war, such a gesture was unheard of. A salute, not of victory, but of respect. A recognition of courage. A moment of humanity in a world consumed by destruction.
Stigler then motioned with his hand, signaling for the bomber to turn north towards neutral Sweden. It was a safer route, one that could spare the crew further danger. But Brown shook his head. He was determined to make it back to England. His wounded crew needed medical attention, and he believed they could make it. Stigler understood. He nodded, then did something even more unthinkable. He began escorting the bomber. For the next 10 minutes, the German ace flew alongside the American bomber, guiding it out of German airspace. He knew the risks. If German anti-aircraft batteries spotted them, both planes could be shot down. If his superiors learned what he had done, he could be court-martialed or worse. But he didn't care. He was protecting them not as enemies, but as fellow airmen. Men who had faced death and refused to surrender. Men who had shown courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Inside the B-17, the crew watched in stunned silence. They had seen death. They had felt terror. But now, they were witnessing something else. Mercy. Eventually, as they neared the North Sea, Stigler gave one final salute, banked his fighter to the left, and disappeared into the clouds. Charlie Brown and his crew made it back to England. Their bomber was barely intact, but they were alive. When they reported the incident, their superiors were skeptical. A German pilot sparing an American bomber, escorting it to safety? It sounded impossible. But it wasn't. It was real. It was human. It was a moment that defied the brutality of war and reminded the world that even in the darkest skies, honor could still shine. Stigler returned to base in silence. He didn't claim the kill. He didn't tell his superiors. He knew that if word got out, he could be punished. Sparing the enemy was treason. But he didn't see it that way. He had followed his conscience. He had chosen mercy over murder, and he had let honor guide his hand. For decades, the story remained buried, a secret carried by two men on opposite sides of a war. But it would not stay hidden forever.
Charlie Brown's B-17 limped across the North Sea, its engines groaning, its fuselage barely intact. Inside, the crew sat in stunned silence. They had survived flak, fighters, and near-total destruction, not because of firepower or luck, but because a German pilot had chosen mercy over murder. When they finally reached England, the bomber touched down at RAF Kimbleton. Ground crews rushed to the aircraft, shocked by the damage. The tail was shredded. Bullet holes riddled the body. One engine was dead. The oxygen system was gone. And yet, they had made it. Charlie Brown filed his mission report, including the incredible encounter with the German fighter. He described how the pilot had flown alongside them, saluted, and escorted them to safety. His superiors listened politely, then quietly dismissed the story. It was too unbelievable, too inconvenient, too human. The report was filed away, classified, forgotten. Meanwhile, in Germany, Franz Stigler returned to base. He landed his Messerschmitt Bf 109 without fanfare. No kill claimed, no questions asked. He didn't speak of what had happened. He couldn't. Sparing the enemy was treason. If word got out, he could be court-martialed or worse. So he stayed silent. For years, the story remained buried. Charlie Brown continued flying missions. Franz Stigler continued fighting. Both men survived the war. Both carried the memory of that day. A moment of honor in a world of chaos. After the war,
Brown returned to the United States. He became a commercial pilot, raised a family, and lived a quiet life. But he never forgot the German pilot who spared him. He often wondered, who was he? Why did he do it? Was he still alive? Stigler, meanwhile, emigrated to Canada. He worked as a mechanic, built a new life, and never spoke of the bomber he had spared. The war was behind him, but that moment in the sky remained etched in his soul.
For more than 4 decades, the story of the German pilot who spared a crippled American bomber remained a mystery, a ghost in the memories of 2 men who had once locked eyes across the sky. Charlie Brown, now long retired from the U.S. Air Force, had never forgotten that day over Germany. The image of the Messerschmitt Bf-109 flying wingtip to wingtip with his shattered B-17 haunted him. He had told the story to his family, to fellow veterans, even to historians, but no one knew who the German pilot was. His name had never been recorded. His act of mercy had never been acknowledged. In the late 1980s, Brown decided it was time to find him. He began writing letters to veteran organizations, Luftwaffe associations, and military history groups. He described the mission, the damage to his plane, the location, the date, and the incredible moment when a German pilot had spared his life. He asked one simple question: does anyone know who this man was? For months, there was silence. Then, in 1990, a letter arrived. It was from a man named Franz Stigler, living in Vancouver, Canada. He had read Brown's account in a newsletter for Luftwaffe veterans. The details matched perfectly: the date, the location, the damage to the bomber, the salute. Stigler wrote, "I was the one." Charlie Brown was stunned. After 47 years, the man who had spared his life had finally been found. They began corresponding, cautiously at first, then with growing warmth. They shared memories, photographs, and reflections. They spoke of war, of youth, of survival, and of that one extraordinary moment in the sky. In 1990, they met in person. The reunion was emotional. 2 men, once enemies, now stood face to face, not as soldiers, but as brothers. They embraced, they cried, and they talked for hours. Stigler explained why he hadn't fired. He spoke of his code of honor, of the horror he saw in the bomber's condition, and the humanity he saw in Brown's eyes. He said, "I didn't have the heart to finish you off. I flew beside you to make sure no one else would either." Brown thanked him, not just for sparing his life, but for reminding him that even in war, decency could survive. Their story began to spread. Newspapers picked it up. Documentaries were made. Veterans and civilians alike were moved by the tale of 2 pilots who had chosen compassion over combat. But for Brown and Stigler, it wasn't about publicity. It was about closure, about friendship, about honoring the moment that had defined their lives. They remained close until the end. They visited each other often, attended air shows together, and even gave joint talks about their experience. When asked how they saw each other, Brown replied, "He was the brother I never knew I had." And Stigler? He said simply, "I love you, Charlie." After their emotional reunion in 1990,
Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler began a friendship that would last for the rest of their lives. What had started as a moment of mercy in the skies over Germany had now become a bond deeper than nationality, ideology, or history. They spoke often, by phone, by letter, and in person. They visited each other's homes, they met each other's families, and they shared their story with anyone who would listen. Not to boast, not to seek fame, but to remind the world that even in war, humanity can survive. Together, they attended air shows and veteran reunions. They gave joint talks at schools, military academies, and historical societies. Audiences were captivated, not just by the dramatic events of December 20th, 1943, but by the quiet dignity of the men who had lived it. Charlie Brown would often say, "Franz was the brother I never knew I had." And Stigler, with tears in his eyes, would reply, "I love you, Charlie." Their friendship was a living testament to the power of compassion. They had once been enemies, trained to kill each other, but at a moment of clarity, one man chose honor over victory. And that choice changed both of their lives forever. They became symbols, not of war, but of reconciliation. Their story was featured in newspapers, magazines, and documentaries. Historians praised it, veterans embraced it, and young people learned from it. But for Brown and Stigler, the attention was secondary. What mattered most was the bond they shared, forged not in peace, but in the crucible of war. They often reflected on that day over Bremen. Brown remembered the terror, the damage, the helplessness. Stigler remembered the faces, the courage, the moment he chose not to fire. And together, they remembered the salute, a gesture that defied everything the war had taught them. In 2008, Charlie Brown passed away at the age of 87. Franz Stigler followed just a few months later, at 92. They had lived full lives, they had found peace, and they had left behind a story that would echo through generations. Their tale is now taught in military ethics courses. It's cited in leadership seminars, it's shared in classrooms, and it's remembered by those who believe that even in the darkest moments, light can still break through. Because war is not just about weapons and strategy. It's about choices, about humanity, about the moments when one person decides to do what's right, even when everything says otherwise. Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler made that choice, and in doing so, they showed the world what it means to be truly brave.
Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler passed away in 2008, just months apart. But their story, a moment of mercy in the middle of one of history's most brutal wars, lives on. It lives on in classrooms, where students learn that war is not just about battles and borders, but about choices. It lives on in military academies, where future officers study the ethics of combat and the power of restraint. And it lives on in the hearts of those who believe that even in the darkest skies, humanity can still shine through. Their story has been told in books, documentaries, and lectures. It has been shared by veterans, historians, and pilots. But more than anything, it has been remembered by ordinary people. People who see in it a reminder that compassion is not weakness and that honor is not obsolete. Franz Stigler never received the Knight's Cross. He never added Charlie Brown's B-17 to his kill count. But in the end, he earned something far greater: the respect of a man he could have killed, and the admiration of a world that would one day learn what he had done. Charlie Brown, too, carried that moment with him for the rest of his life. He had seen the worst of war, the flak, the fire, the fear. But he had also seen its opposite, A single act of mercy that saved his crew and changed his soul. In their final years, Brown and Stigler were inseparable. They traveled together, spoke together, and honored each other. When asked why he had spared the bomber, Stigler would simply say, "I didn't have the heart to finish them off. I saw them and thought, I can't kill these boys." And when asked what that moment meant to him, Charlie Brown would reply, "To me, Franz was more than a friend. He was the reason I got to live. He was the reason I got to grow old." Their story is not just about war. It's about what it means to be human. It's about the choices we make when no one is watching. It's about the courage to show kindness when cruelty is expected. In a world that often celebrates destruction, the story of Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler reminds us that the greatest victories are not always won with bullets, but with grace. So let us remember them, not just as pilots, but as men who chose honor over hatred, mercy over murder, and friendship over fear. Because in the end, that's the kind of legacy that truly endures.